Welcome back to Historical Context. Today we continue our Middle Colonies unit. Today's discussion shifts over from George Calvert's arrival to Virginia to another gentleman's arrival, Governor Harvey. And where we last left off, George Calvert arrived in Virginia in September of 1629. And in the last couple of weeks, we talked about how that trip was handled from the aspect of Mr. Calvert, but today we're going to talk about the Virginian perspective. Calvert's Catholicism, as we've heard, was not appreciated in Jamestown. They were more Church of England type people. And when he refused to take an oath of allegiance, he was asked to leave. Now, everything I'm seeing in terms of George Calvert being in Jamestown makes him one of the highest ranking people in English society to ever visit. So it's a little odd to see that he was just so quickly asked to leave. In the notes on Virginia, a letter was sent from the Council of Virginia to the Privy Council that's back in England in the fall of 1629. The note was discussed last week, but the contents were essentially saying that Lord Baltimore refused to take the oath. They recommended taking, Lord Baltimore recommended an alternative oath based on his service to King James, but the colonists refused this, and because they could not imagine that King James' beliefs aligned with Lord Baltimore's oath, so that whole falling out occurred, and it occurred rather quickly. I mean, Calvert was not there very long. The letter read more like a CYA memo covering your backside in case Lord Baltimore went back to England and created trouble for the Virginia colonists. Some people were not as nice about this whole thing. In the General Court records on March 25th of 1630, Thomas Tyndall was sentenced to be pillared for 2 hours for, quote, giving Lord Baltimore the lie and threatening to knock him down, end quote. So George Calvert, aka Lord Baltimore's stay in Virginia was short and certainly not sweet. A major item for discussion in Virginia in 1629 was the fortification of the colony. And if you'll recall from previous episodes, it's only been 7 years since the massacre at Jamestown, so I'm sure that was weighing heavy on people's minds as they consider fortification. The House of Burgesses took up the matter in its October meeting, and there was a long debate regarding whether the fort ought to be built. No action ended up coming from that meeting. Sir John Harvey, who was the new governor there, also took notes, and in his notes and in the debate records of the House of Burgesses, the location of Point Comfort seems to have been the most ideal location as it represents the mouth of the river and no ship can pass it without being in shot of it. So it was a good area in case French or Dutch or some other enemy ship, maybe even a pirate, were to come in. This fort area would protect the colony from a naval invasion. Harvey requested King Charles send over 50 men now and 50 men per year for the next 3 years to complete the work of the fort. And the reason he asked for 50 men a year for the next 3 years was that they would replace the sick and the dying who did come over. So think of that. You're planning basically a 100% turnover year over year for sickness and death. Harvey also requests preachers, ammunition, money for his travels, and invited the city of London to send over 100 poor boys and girls, possibly for indentured servitude, although he did not say. The Crown replied by stating ministers are free to voluntarily go anywhere they please at their own expense, And the king promised to send over men and munitions to survey and build the fort, and agreed to send over the 100 poor boys and girls. Keep in mind at this point that Harvey is governing from England and not from Virginia. So when I say Harvey's notes in the House of Burgesses debate records are talking about this, they're talking about it from two different locations, Harvey being in England, the House of Burgesses being in Jamestown. In September of 1629, the Crown passed a duty of 3 pence per pound on tobacco. Harvey ends up sailing over to Virginia in early 1630, arriving in the month of May to assume leadership over the colony. Harvey notes in his first letter back to England that the Virginia planters did not plant adequate corn for the colony because of, quote, their greed for tobacco. We've talked about this a little bit in previous episodes. Even King Charles weighed in on this, where he felt the colony was over-reliant on tobacco and needed to diversify away from that crop. Colonists liked tobacco because it was easy and lucrative for them, but to the point where they wouldn't plant corn is just outright insane. So now you have your food supply being threatened because people are wanting or at least the market is more advantageous to planting tobacco than corn. Harvey adds in his note that a fort will be constructed at Point Comfort, which was discussed earlier. War is continuing with the natives until they move away or seek peace. And Harvey made a proposition to the assembly for the creation of diverse industries. This was something King Charles wanted. He adds that the countryside will be surveyed for the best places to establish these industry settings. Harvey writes a few weeks later that he has received grievous complaints against his predecessor, John Pott, who served as acting governor until Harvey came over. The complaints included stealing cattle and killing hogs. Harvey reported that he had confined Potts to his plantation, which was 7 miles away from the town. Harvey said he also called an assembly to order more corn be planted. Current House of Burgesses records that I read run from October 1629 to March of 1632 with no meeting records in between those dates. So when Harvey says he called an assembly, it could have been referring to the council and not the House of Burgesses. Harvey wrote to the Privy Council in October of 1630, reiterating that he was discouraged upon arrival at the colony, having nothing but tobacco lying around. He did have a solution. Let's have a look. Whereupon it was resolved to send 2 small barks into Chesapeake Bay to trade for corn with beads, hatchets, etc. So Harvey wants to trade with the natives to get that food supply back up. And he adds that the trip yielded 300 bushels of corn and that another trip was being planned. He also talked about Dr. Pott. Let's have a look. I found one Dr. John Potts seeking his own benefit by foul and covetousness ways, as by pardoning willful murder. And you can read a link to that pardon. There's a link in the description so that you could see for yourself if Dr. Pott actually did pardon willful murder. But that's what Harvey is bringing up against him. He adds the other charges already mentioned and says that he will be moving against him at a later date. Harvey estimates at the time that there are approximately 2,500 people in Virginia. In a July 1630 letter, Harvey notes that Dr. Pott was found guilty of offenses, but there was a problem. Let's have a look. But in regard, he is the only physician in this colony, and so well acquainted with the diseases here. May it therefore please your majesty to take into your gracious consideration his long being in the country. So he's a horrible person. We got to do something about him. He's stealing, pardoning willful murder, but he's the only doctor they have. And so Harvey basically tells the crown that they're the only ones that can pardon, I guess, his trespasses, which I find very interesting. Harvey puts all this work together, condemning his predecessor, and then dumps on King Charles the facts and says, you're the only one that can let him go, and by the way, we are very dependent upon him. Dr. Pott's wife would actually sail back to England to plead for her husband's pardon, and the king would ultimately grant it. So Dr. Pott is allowed to continue as a free citizen and physician in Jamestown. Now we move to 1631, where William Claiborne sets up his trading post at Kent Island. The colonists are becoming aware of Lord Baltimore's attempts to become their neighbor, and attempts to reestablish the Virginia Company, remember them from before, are also being made. In April of 1631, Governor Harvey sends a letter back to England stating he is not popular with the colonists. He says that the colonists are giving him, and I quote, daily grief and, quote, stand contesting and disputing my authority. He requests help in dealing with the problem. While Harvey does not detail why the discontent occurred, he mentions a case where he censured a colonist, and that censuring may have upset the group. It is also important to note that Dr. Pott was actually popular amongst the colonists prior to Harvey's arrival, and his handling of that situation may have contributed to his problems. In May 1631, the English government responds by establishing a group of commissioners for Virginia. And I kind of read this as if it was like a task force of commissioners. The commissioners' tasks are to assess the state of the colony, determine what products are most profitable, how the colony can be better advanced, and finding new settlers, planters, and adventurers for the colony. Francis Wyatt, a former governor who went back to England on personal business, is a member of this commission. Between August and October of 1631, the commissioners weigh in on what they think should happen in Virginia. The commission comes back with recommendations. First, they recommend the government remain under the monarch's control with a council of 24 persons and a president. The council would reside in or near London, and the president would be senior to the current governor position. It's interesting because they're essentially recommending more layers. Second, they recommend a governor and council in Virginia, similar to what they already have, but this group would have the power to create ordinances, sort of like a local city or municipal council. The General Assembly would have the power to create laws, but they must be approved by England. Third, the commissioners recommend granting a charter for a new company of adventurers. So there's the mention of the Virginia Company, a new company of adventurers, where the adventurers would be the of the company's members, which would make sense. It also recommends restoration of the land patent. So the original patent that was tied to the Virginia Company, and we go all the way back to the beginning of our Jamestown unit, to have that. They have another recommendation. Let's have a look. and further that this company may have granted unto them by this charter the ancient territories, lands, and islands of and belonging to Virginia in as ample manner as the same were bounded and granted unto the late company by all or any of the several grants or letters of the late King James. I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist here, but I think this was an attempt to get the Virginia Company back together and to restore the patent to keep Lord Baltimore out of Maryland. Because if you restore the patent, now he cannot go in and colonize Maryland. But since the Virginia Company is disbanded, Jamestown is now a royal colony, the Crown can do whatever it wants in terms of sending people to specific parts of the New World. And this obviously becomes an issue in England because attempts are already underway for Lord Baltimore to obtain his patent. The document goes on to state that foreigners and strangers have usurped the Crown's authority and settled in the region of the original patent. It does not mention the Dutch by name, but I think that's who they're referring to here. Fourth was the recommendation of an annual pension or award. And lastly, they recommended that they be able to confer with the Attorney General on matters regarding the colony to work out the finer details. So this commission wants FaceTime with the Attorney General of England to make sure everything is on the up and up. On November 25th, 1631, King Charles issues a statement saying that he will take up the matter. On the same date, a document, Considerations Against a New Company, is published. The document mentions reasons against establishing or re-establishing the Virginia Company. First, it mentions the prior company was highly factious and did not consider the needs of the colony. And that's right. If you recall from previous episodes, the Virginia Company just got crowded with shareholders. And they all had these competing interests, and they were all in England, and so the needs of the colony didn't matter. The document goes on to state that England would have to give up revenue that it has collected in order to have the new company then come in and collect that revenue. The original proclamation that makes Virginia a royal colony actually conflicts with the recreation of the company. The colony's economy is doing better since the change away from a company. And the document also concludes by saying that Spain has also tried and failed at similar structures. Meanwhile, in Virginia, tensions between Harvey and the council needed to be worked out, and it was just bubbling up. And on December 20th, 1631, an agreement between the two was signed. I want to note here that the council that I'm referring to is more like the cabinet of the governor. It's not the House of Burgesses. That's the legislative authority there. The agreement that Harvey and his council signed stated that the two sides would, quote, silence these unhappy differences, bury all forepast complaints and accusations in general reconciliation, end quote. One problem that Harvey had here is that he inherited a council that was made up of people that he did not choose, and people who also had the ability to overrule his decisions. When Harvey was on this council, he was an N of 1, and there were 5 or 6 other people on it. So his voice could quickly get drowned out by the consensus. The group agreed to follow the commission And that was the commissioners that put together those recommendations, along with the king's direction. And the council agreed to assist the governor. So it looks like things are moving forward. The agreement was similar to the Mayflower Compact in its attempt to reconcile the parties. If you'll recall from the Plymouth episode, the very beginning, the Mayflower Compact occurred at about the same time when there was disagreement and some discontent boiling up right on the Mayflower ship as they're coming into New England. So this agreement was similar in nature in terms of what it was trying to do. Unfortunately, it was not going to work. And we'll talk about that next time on Historical Context.